Welcome to the Pulse of the Parish podcast, hosted by St. Bernard Chamber of Commerce. I'm Jacques Alfonso, owner of St. Bernard Realty. Joining me today is Adam Tutar with the Regional Planning Commission to discuss the Brownfield Grant Program. Thank you for joining us, Adam. Will you tell me a little bit about yourself and define what the Brownfield Grant Program is?
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I am the Regional Brownfield Program Coordinator at the Regional Planning Commission. And the Brownfield Program, or a Brownfield Grant, comes to us here in the states or in the parishes from the Environmental Protection Agency. And the purpose of this grant is it is really an environmental tool, or in an economic tool to help our blighted and our vacant properties be put back into productive reuse. So every community, we have these old properties, maybe they're old eyesores, old storefronts, old factories, old gas stations. And the community really wants to see these properties be brought back into use and become assets for their communities again. And the Brownfield Grant really is a way to help nudge those projects along so that they can be restored and that they can be put back into use.
Man, that's awesome. Is the grant only used for vacant sites, or is it used for like if there's like a old storage building or things like that?
Yeah. So the definition of a brownfield is the EPA defines a brownfield. It kind of has a very low bar. Really, any property that is vacant or abandoned or underutilized. So it can be an empty lot. It can be an old building that's been abandoned, or it can be a building that's just sort of only partially used, really meets the definition of a brownfield. And so from there, those sites are eligible to have brownfield funds spent on them. And, it's kind of like, paying for if you're a developer, these old sites may have some environmental history to them. And that environmental history is a risk to an investor and a risk to a developer. So it kind of might make them scared to invest. And so instead of having new development coming into your community and coming into these old sites, that environmental concern may scare folks off. And you don't want to scare them off. So the whole point of the brownfield funding is to kind of bridge that gap, to say to a developer, hey, if you are interested in this site, the brownfield funds will help mitigate some of that risk for you by helping to pay for some of that costs to alleviate the environmental concern so that you can go ahead and invest in this property instead of going somewhere else. And in a nutshell, that's what the brownfield funding is there to do, whether it's a vacant lot, an old building, an old gas station, an old school or government building. All of those types of properties qualify as brownfield sites.
So Adam, how did St. Bernard Parish end up with this Brownfield Grant Program?
Yeah, so it started about a year or so ago when I was wrapping up, kind of closing out my previous grant award at the RPC, and we were working with some neighborhoods in New Orleans, like in the lower Ninth Ward.
And I'm sorry, I mean to cut you off. What's the RPC?
Sure, we are the Regional Planning Commission.
I gotcha.
We kind of serve the greater New Orleans area. And I was ready to go back out and apply for a whole new grant, a new assessment grant. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, EPA asks, where do you want to focus these funds? We can't just apply for an award to spend throughout the region. They want to see kind of a geographical focus. So I tossed it back to our region and I said, I'm about to apply for a grant. Who is interested in kind of working with me, and who is interested in these funds? And the Economic Development Foundation here in St. Bernard and the nonprofit folks here in St. Bernard reached back out right away, and they were super interested. They were aware of, they knew something about brownfields. Mm-hmm. They knew they had sites that were probably brownfield sites that could benefit from this. And they were really interested in working with the Regional Planning Commission on getting these funds into St. Bernard Parish. And so it was really great to partner with all of our stakeholders here. And so it's a great partnership where we have At the Regional Planning Commission, we can do the kind of the back end of the grant and administer the funds and manage the grant award, but really it goes into St. Bernard Parish, into the sites that you all want them for. So.
On the Brownfield site, like in my experience with a buyer that I was working with, we had a property. He was doing a commercial loan, and we had to do phase one. And the phase one was fine, but after phase one, the next step would have been what they call phase two. This grant would help cover the cost of doing a phase two study.
Correct.
On the property.
Correct. There are several different. The EPA has different flavors of brownfield grants. Many of which are available for this community. Talking about this specific grant, this is what is called an assessment grant. So. Primarily, this grant is meant to fund, as you mentioned, phase one or phase two assessments. And these are kind of like it's kind of like doing due diligence if you're going to go buy a house for yourself, but on the commercial side of things. So if you and your family are going to go buy a house, maybe you make an offer, and then the next thing you do is you go do an inspection. You pay somebody to go out there and inspect the plumbing, inspect the air conditioning, and all that, and that costs you a few $1,000s. The phase one and the phase two is kind of like paying for that on the commercial side of things. So if you are going to go buy an old warehouse or buy a lot that was a dry cleaners or a gas station, you want to do that due diligence to find out what you're getting into before you spend all this money. But for a commercial property, that due diligence can be quite costly, just to inspect the site, just to take samples of the soil or the water to find out is there any residual contamination there. So again, we don't want to scare the developers away. So the brownfield funding is going to pay for that due diligence to do that really thorough examination of the site so you know what you're buying. And that is, yes, the phase one. And if necessary, this grant will pay for the phase two as well.
What is at what point is it determined that you need to do a phase two after a phase one is completed?
Yep. So we begin with the phase one. It's usually pretty straightforward. It's like a 30-day process. We go to the property, take some photos, review some old records, maybe even talk to the neighbors. They may know something about the property that because they've lived there for 20 years. Mm-hmm. We do a record search, and at the end of that phase one report, our environmental team will come back and say, hey, we took a really close look at this property, everything that you can kind of see with the naked eye, and we don't see anything to be concerned about here, and therefore no additional testing is recommended or sampling is recommended. And then you're kind of done. You're good to go. Or that phase one comes back and says, hey, we saw some things that look a little suspicious. We think there might be a problem. We're going to recommend you go ahead and do additional sampling, and they may specify specifically what types of sampling they suggest. And when you get that recommendation, it's pretty explicit in the phase one. It's like built right into it. That's when it's time to go into it to do the phase two. And then you may do things such as testing the soil for contaminants, testing the groundwater. You may be testing the air for vapor intrusion. You may be, if it's an old building, you may be actually testing for asbestos or lead-based paint. And you're kind of really going into the building or the site and that phase two to find out exactly what's there and specifically where it's located.
So does the site actually need to have contamination on it?
So in order to be a brownfield, that's a good question. So technically, before you assess a site, you don't really know what's there. Right. You may kind of have an idea,
right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's a really good question. And this is where it gets back to what is a brownfield? Is a brownfield contaminated? Well, how do you know if it's contaminated if you haven't assessed it? Mm-hmm. So in their wisdom, the EPA defines a brownfield as something with a perceived contamination. So if you look at a site and you can say, well, I think it might because of XYZ. Maybe it's next to a dump. Right. Or maybe the building I think it may have lead paint. Just the perception of a hazard of some sort is enough to say, well, you better go check it out. So you're good to go. and then either it comes back yay or nay.
That's good. It's kind of like covering your bases,
Exactly.
So what if there's buildings that were improperly remodeled after, Hurricane Katrina or after Hurricane Isaac? Would those properties qualify for a Brownfield?
Possibly.
I know we talked about the perception.
Yeah, every brownfield is like a snowflake, and so we really have to look at each site on a case-by-case basis. If anyone thinks they may have a brownfield site, I would encourage you just to reach out and we can talk about each site on a case-by-case basis. But it's possible. It depends on what the current use of the site is, what the proposed redevelopment of the site is, what the potential contamination on the site may be. Even if it was rehabilitated at some point, that doesn't mean that there is no longer any concern. We would just look at each site kind of on a case-by-case basis, and there's no harm in doing that at all. We always recommend, if you think there is a concern, we are more than happy to assist, usually if we can, assist in that phase 1 study and see what it comes back and says.
Right, it doesn't hurt just to check it out, right?
Exactly.
So, man, seems like a really really helpful grant, because we have a lot of, we have like old gas stations in St. Bernard Parish. The parish is, older, so I'm sure there's plenty of buildings and properties that might have lead-based paint or asbestos or things like that. How large is this grant? Like as far as like, can it be used on multiple sites? How is it distributed, and what amount of money is the grant actually?
So the grant award is for $500,000, and that is to cover assessments. And there's also a little bit of that is set aside for planning as well. So maybe before you dig into a brownfield site, you want to do like a site reuse plan of some sort or a market analysis. Those are all activities that are also eligible under this grant. It's kind of a sidebar. It's a $500,000 grant, and it's meant to be used on multiple sites throughout the community. What EPA does not want to see with this particular grant is some mega project, no matter how great it might be. They don't want to see this grant invested on some singular huge project. They really want to see this spread throughout the community. In this case, pretty much all of St. Bernard Parish is eligible, so that we can help multiple projects move ahead and come back into use in the community. There are some grants that are site-specific. There are some grants that are community-wide, and this is the community-wide variety. So we want to really spread this out across as many projects as we can while we have it.
How much of the grant, like what percentage of the grant can be spent on one property?
So you kind of got me. I have to go back and check the specific regs. It's something like 30%. I don't think we can spend more than 30% of the whole grant on a single address.
Gotcha. So, yeah, we can spend almost a third of the grant on one property.
Right.
Probably need a lot. It probably has a lot of environmental issues.
Right. And that makes my job easier. That's fewer projects that I've got to manage. But we do want to. If you have a great, we'll do it. But we do want to see them spread. We want to see a lot of great projects come to fruition if we can.
When is this program, like when does the grant end? Like how what's the time frame we have to work with?
It is a 4-year grant. And the clock we started ticking on October 1st when we got the award. So we got 4 years. But kind of keep in mind, if for a site to move from a phase 1 through a phase 2, that can be like a 1.5-year process. So we're not waiting to the 11th hour to enroll sites into the program. We really want to get sites enrolled as soon as we can, get them into the program, because sometimes, things come up. Sometimes you just can't even get onto a property. Sometimes if a property is owned by a government entity or a large corporation or a property owner who's kind of on the fence about things, it can take months of permitting just to get access onto a site, and then you begin a 1.5 years of assessing. So we don't want to wait until the end of the 4 years to get sites into the program. It is a 4-year award, but the sooner that we can get projects enrolled and moving along, definitely the better.
Is there more programs coming down to St. Bernard Parish like this Brownfield program? Or
So EPA, this grant award cycle opens up every single year, and let's kind of open. This is a good way to explain the role of the Regional Planning Commission here to the St. Bernard Parish. Every year, every government entity or nonprofit can apply for a Brownfield award, and if St. Bernard Parish wanted to apply for one this year, they certainly could. So, but the application process can be kind of onerous. It's like many, many, many pages of application. The grant itself can be onerous to manage. I mean, this is bureaucracy, like with a capital B. And I'm a bureaucrat. That's my job, and it can be overwhelming. So the city of New Orleans, for example, has its own Brownfield program, and they have full-time staff, and they have somebody there that does this. The role for the Regional Planning Commission, is our smaller communities, St. Bernard Parish, St. John the Baptist Parish, Marrero, the city of Oswego. They're busy doing the day-to-day things to run your communities, and you don't always have the bandwidth or the capacity or the desire to manage a whole new grant. So you may want that grant award, but not want to deal with the day-to-day minutia of it. And that is where the Regional Planning Commission really can assist, where we can help our smaller communities who want these funds but don't have the bandwidth to manage it. So that's kind of where we come in, and we can support our smaller communities by applying for the award for you, managing the award for you, so that you get all the funding, you get all the great projects,
right,
without having to deal with the EPA and on all the paperwork side of things. So it's a long way of answering your question. Awards are available, every year, but for right now, this is the grant award that we have to work with in St. Bernard Parish for the next couple of years. And when it runs out, I'm always happy to go back and apply for more, but this is a brand new award. We can't apply for any more until we spend down a little bit. We've got to show them we're actually doing our job.
So could you maybe walk me through the process of this? Let's say I've identified my site. What should be my next step?
So the easiest thing to do, if you have a site that you think might be a good project or a good candidate for these funds, and you want to learn more, you want to see, how it's my job to get the money in your hands. So if you want to see how do we connect, simply just reach out to me. I'm on the Regional Planning Commission website. If you just Google me, Adam Tatar, Brownfields, New Orleans, I'm sure I'll pop up. And the first thing we do, we just have a conversation. What have you got? What are you trying to do? And we can make a preliminary determination of oh yeah, this sounds like a Brownfield site. This sounds like it's a good fit. It'll meet the criteria. It'll meet the qualifications of Brownfields, and then I may be able to help you get those funds to cover that phase 1 or that phase 2 if you want. If it's determined that it is an eligible project, we just want to make sure we're kind of covering a few different bases. We want to make sure the community is on board. So I can't fund a project that the neighborhood doesn't like. I can't fund a project that the city council or the council person doesn't like. I can't fund a project that the chamber or the Economic Development Commission doesn't like.
Right.
We want to all be on the same page here. So if everybody is supportive of a project and it meets EPA's checkbox definitions, then absolutely. We fill out a few forms, we get an access agreement, and within a week or two, our environmental team is on the ground beginning those phase 1 or those phase 2 assessments.
Man, sounds really good. Really good. I know it sounds like a complicated process, and it seems like it would be very complex to go through. But just having you here and having you explain it to me,
sure,
for a second time, I'm learning even more.
Sure.
I think this is a very helpful grant, and I think a lot of residents and business owners in St. Bernard Parish would be happy to use this grant money to determine the environmental status of their property.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, my
Adam.
pleasure.
And, it's been very informative, and it's been very helpful, and I really hope a lot of our residents and business owners utilize this. This has been the Pulse of the Parish podcast, and I just want to thank everybody for listening.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.